Hi, welcome to Doing Sociology. Today we have Dr. Suruchi Thapar with us. She is an associate professor at Uppsala University, Sweden. She has a PhD from the Center for the Study of Women and Gender, Department of Sociology, University of Warwick. Some of her published works include Women in the Indian National Movement, Unseen Faces and Unheard Voices, 1930 to 42, published by Sage in 2006, and Post-Colonial and Post-Socialist Dialogues, Intersections, Opacities, Challenges in Feminist Theorizing and Practice, co-edited, published by Routledge in 2021. We welcome you, Dr. Thapar. Thank you for taking time out for Doing Sociology and doing this interview with us.
Thank you so much, Rituparna.
Right. First a question about your very latest research work, where you look at how the bodies of poor Indian women become, available as sites of profit generation through the intersections that exist between neoliberal health policies and then, of course, categories and hierarchies of gender, caste, class, and religion. So could you talk about this little, this research a little more?
Okay, yeah. I think thanks for that question, Rituparna. So this body of research emerges from collaborative research, and this research places transnational commercial surrogacy and the outsourcing of reproductive labor to reproductive labor of women of the global South within an expanding market in body parts and reproductive labor more globally. So the paradox here is that while historically and within the transnational fertility circuit, the bodies of underprivileged Indian women, formerly seen as waste, and their reproduction as something to be controlled by the post-independence Indian state, but also policymakers in the north, in the global north. So how these intersections and synergies emerge, and how the bodies were transformed into sites of profit generation within the reproductive industry of the neoliberal Indian state. Now, these practices arguably have reconfigured with the ban by the Modi government in 2020 on surrogacy for commercial purposes. So the interesting thing here is that how to understand or how to analyze this through a reproductive justice perspective. And it becomes particularly relevant in the Indian setting, given the symbiosis we have between reproductive politics, eugenics, and neo-Malthusian ideologies, which have historically, you could say, shaped the idea of overpopulation during the early 20th century. To give you an example here, what we noticed was that how upper class neo-Malthusian agenda, it interweaved in very complicated ways with upper caste agenda of Brahmanical Hinduism. Yeah, and the central argument here concerned the reproductive excesses of the lower castes and religious minorities, in particular Muslims. And certain kind of trajectories and certain kind of the reopening of these debates is very much evident under Modi's regime. So for example, the targeting of certain population as excessive, particularly Muslims, again, through notions such as the love jihad, or even the Citizenship Amendment Act, of 2019. So those have to be also kept in mind together with this historical trajectories. Now, as you would agree, negative eugenics have been aggressively practiced in India, and again targeting some of the most vulnerable communities. An example here could be the widespread use and abuse of sterilization as it exemplified in the Chhattisgarh sterilization scandal in 2014. And what we see is that with the exception of a very short period of forced mass vasectomies between 1975 and 1977, female sterilization has been the main instrument of India's population policies, yeah? And it also, of course, as you would also agree, it has also been the most common form of contraception available in India since the 1970s. So the kind of moving on from there, if you place this idea, this context more globally and specifically in the context of India, we see that reproductive justice has been, while it has been addressed, you could say, in relation to class and economic status, very little attention has been given to the question of caste. And in relation to caste, what I'm interested in hearing is the voices of Dalit women. And if you sort of map the reproductive justice framework on that, so it would then account for some of the endemic social, political, economic inequalities among different communities, which also shape their ability to access a good life. So this intersectionality of oppression then becomes very important and also a very complex issue to understand.
Right. This is very interestingly put. Now, when you look at the institutional discourse on be it interpersonal violence or something like reproductive health, do you think that there is a nurturement of, a culture of blame and responsibility and how these discourses operate?
Yeah, thanks for that, Harivanna. I think this is also, it's kind of, we have been talking about this for a very long time. And as you say, it becomes very pertinent, especially when you're discussing different modalities of violence, yeah? Particularly interpersonal violence, whether you're looking at domestic violence, whether you're looking at sexual violence. Now, the intention here in this body of research was not to deny the enabling and autonomy enhancing potential of institutional practices, right? These practices which are embedded within statutory and voluntary organization, and largely kind of working with women who have experienced violence, yeah? And also kind of violence, looking at it in a more kind of sort of moving also beyond the interpersonal frame, but also looking at the structural modalities of oppression. So the research here, while acknowledging this potential and this autonomy enhancing potential of organization, also kind of locates or tries to identify that sometimes the institutions may fail some women, yeah? And I'm very careful to say some women because, of course, these are very debatable subjects. Now, the tension here then is that how there are, the tension you could identify between, let's say, institutional discourses and individual perception, and how these can contribute to an understanding that sometimes violence is natural, normal, to be expected, or understandable. So, for example, you have specific discourses that imply that women are kind of responsible for their victimhood. And Nazaruthiparna, you would also agree, very much kind of reflected in statements such as, she asked for it. Yeah. And also another example could be that how sometimes violence against women, it can be legitimized by society at large, right? To the extent that it becomes possible then to deny that violence, again, whether you're looking at domestic or sexual violence. So you deny that violence takes place at all, or if you make a claim that it happens, then you could you sort of put the burden of responsibility onto the women themselves, or in a depending on the kind of study you have, you could also lay a claim that it is applicable to, let's say, unusual or deviant couples. Here also, it's important to bear in mind the kind of popular sort of representations that we have. For example, in newspapers, magazines, television reports, which are also, I would say, complicit in constructing and reproducing images of violence, which also in turn then influences the way individuals construct their own conceptions of what is normal and acceptable. And this kind of has also been sort of taking you slightly on a slight tangent here. It has been explained as patriarchal resistance. And there are sort of, you could identify three implications in this sort of resistance discourse. The first is normalization of violence, let's say interpersonal violence. And then the second is the diversion of attention from men's responsibility in violence. And the third could be the distortion of women's violence and what they go through. Now, interestingly, you can also relate it to some of the discourses that were really prevalent post-2012 gang rape in New Delhi. And both at the national level, a kind of discourses that emerged, of victim blaming, putting the responsibility on the couple. What were they doing? Why were they out so late at night? And also some of the statements made by one of the rapists. But on the other hand, there's also a wider discourse here, which involved how Western feminists construed this reality. For example, you had the emergence of the discourse that India is the rape capital and that rape is endemic to the Indian society. So the debate becomes even more complex when you have when you go beyond the national level and you look at how the international community, both the media as well as academics, were relating to the violences that women undergo, a reality which is not just confined to India, but a reality that informs women both in the global South and the global North.
Right.
So, in other words, in a kind of nutshell, I think that not to put the blame on statutory and voluntary organizations who are doing a remarkable job in such advocacy work, in the sort of volunteering work, in talking to victims of violence. But what it's important is that sometimes these professional attitudes of non-blame, they may not always be very straightforward and an easy matter to deal with.
Right. Dr. Thapar, you talk about the global South and North, and this is the right moment to ask the question, because in one of your articles, you talk about something very interesting called decolonial feminism. Of course, we've heard a lot about decolonization now, but we would be very interested to know what decolonial feminism means and, why do you think it's a necessary methodological approach?
Yeah, Rituparna, you're absolutely right. I mean, we have a lot of, the atmosphere is, let's say, quite charged, and, decolonizing the academy is sort of a global slogan now. But what we wanted to alert in this piece of writing was that not to conflate processes of decolonization, where you're looking at certain Western epistemic practices and how they filter into the global South, but to actually separate processes of decolonization from decoloniality. And for that, it's very important to to actually lay out right at the start, what is coloniality first, before we talk about decoloniality, right? And how we understand coloniality is, it's like you could say that coloniality is the full dependence on models of thinking, making, and interpreting the world on the norms which are created and imposed by and in Western modernity. So then decoloniality, you could argue, it becomes it's an epistemic, a political and cultural movement for emancipation from some of these limitations. And what it does is it foregrounds the fact that the achievements of modernity are inseparable from issues such as racism, heteropatriarchy, economic exploitation, and discrimination of non-European knowledge systems, right? So there is a stress here in decoloniality on the indigeneity of decolonial thought. Just the way there was stress on subalternity, migration, and creolization in the post-colonial case, yeah? Now, to take it a little bit further, we sort of identify three kind of seminal ideas with decoloniality and decolonial feminism. The first is the concept of imperial difference. The second is the concept of coloniality of gender. And the third is the concept of delinking. And these three, in my understanding, constitute some of the focal points in understanding what exactly is decolonial thinking. So looking at the first one, like imperial difference. So here you could argue that imperial difference, when you look at the concept of imperial difference, it somehow disrupts the sort of the homogeneity that is embedded in the idea of imperial spatiality. And in turn, it complicates it by drawing attention to various, you could say, complete or partial losers that failed to fulfill their imperial missions, yeah? Or they, let's say, in this sort of hierarchy, they occupied, let's say, second-class places, yeah, in this imperial hierarchy. And often they competed with each other for power, right? So, for example, you have the Ottoman Sultanate, you have Tsarist Russia, which actually became zones of, you could say, non-European imperial difference, because they were rooted in non-European religions, languages, and economic models, and other kinds of ethnic racial classifications, yeah, right? Now, interestingly here, Sweden is an example of this internal imperial difference, largely because of its sort of suspended local territorial expansion in the Baltic region, which was carefully, you could say, disassociated from subsequent historical self-representation. And I'll explain what this means. So, in other words, what we are trying to do with the idea of imperial difference is that not to look at this sort of, to sort of dismantle this dichotomy between the West and the other, right? Which is very much kind of part of the post-colonial thought, but to look at these sort of differences that explain the imperial trajectories and different forms of different imperial formations. Let's say post-colonial, if they have focused a lot on Asia and Africa, then decolonial thinkers have focused a lot on, let's say, the Americas, right? South America, Latin America, even though interestingly, they were emerging at the same time. So this lack of dialogue between post-colonialism and decolonialism is also something which can be a cause of further debate, and also, of course, and also a direction that future research can take. Yeah. Now, if you look at coloniality of gender, sort of kind of taking on board a very important theorist that influenced my work, which was Maria Lugonis's work, largely talking about the Amerindias, she kind of also highlights that how it's important to understand coloniality of gender, or the imposition of gender binaries in societies where gender as a concept never existed. So here, talking about, as I was talking about indigeneity, whether you're looking at the Amerindias or you're looking at the Sami community in Sweden, the idea of coloniality of gender and the creation of gender hierarchies is also something that decolonial thinking takes on board. Then the third idea, which is about delinking. And here, what decolonial feminism really wants to assert is the importance of delinking or disassociating from the Western canon, right? Now, always one gets asked the question, okay, so what about post-colonialism? Kind of, you know, as a scholar emerging very much and having been, having spent most of my life in the global South, right? So you could say that while post-colonialism tries to reform some of these imperial linkages from within, it somehow limits its own capacity for imagining strategies of resistance. Okay, so in this way, decolonial thinking as well as indigenous critical discourses, they have gone a little bit beyond post-colonial scholarship, yeah? While post-colonial scholarship remains very much bound to modernity's Eurocentric perspectives, right? While simultaneously critiquing it. The decolonial feminism sort of questions the hegemony of the master's house, if you want to put it in that way, or in fact, the mastery itself. So as a sort of concluding point in relation to delinking, you could also say that, you know, what is happening is that feminist scholars have started looking at or trying to learn from indigenous epistemes globally to understand how we can dismantle the master's house.
Right. So again, you know, keeping in with the theme, you've of course been teaching in Sweden, and you know, you've also worked and researched. So how do you look at race, you know, in Sweden from a sociological perspective? Do you think that being non-Swedish would help in sort of locating the paradoxes of visible and invisible identities?
Yeah. So I think that there are, I can answer this as in like two components, yeah? Now, in relation to the first half of your question, Rituparna, I think it's very important to understand or to kind of locate this within the discourse of Swedish exceptionalism, what is referred as Swedish exceptionalism. And what it does is it constructs Sweden as gender equal, anti-racist, very much detached from a colonial past. And that connects to the answer to the previous question as well, you know, that decolonial thinking actually, through the logic of imperial difference, sort of foregrounds Sweden as one of the competitors in this imperial kind of race for power. Okay, so when you have this kind of construction of Sweden, right, as detached from a colonial past, as anti-racist, then what it does is that it renders any discussion of race, racism, or for that matter, racializing processes very hard to conceptualize. The kind of, you know, you can get an understanding of the kind of political environment that I am embedded in and how to sort of disengage from that environment from time to time. And interestingly, the term race was sort of kind of removed from Swedish law. And that was you could say, the height of racial color blindness, right? Way back in the 1970s, like in 1973, the Swedish government very much kind of argued that it was very unnecessary to have these laws against racism in Sweden, as the majority of the Swedish people were regarded as anti-racist. So you can see the sort of the problematic historical trajectory to that. And then it was later in 2014 and even more kind of moving on from there, even, politicians, for example, the integration minister, they also argue for the removal of race from the vocabulary, and kind of arguing that if you remove race, then perhaps you will be able to steer Sweden away from xenophobia. Okay, so now what we see is that in this sort of neoliberal restructuring and silencing of racism, it has sort of fed into an ideology of color blindness, which in turn makes racism more invisible. Okay, and this ideology of color blindness, yeah, you could say, becomes more like a cover, like an ideological cover for a very covert and institutionalized system for the maintenance of white privilege, right? Furthermore, you can also kind of argue that this sort of color blindness is very much grounded in an epistemology of ignorance. By that, what I mean is a process of knowing, which is very much designed to produce ignorance around white privilege, yeah? Their culpability and also how embedded it is structurally. So to kind of put it in a shorter sort of, in a nutshell, you could say that when you have this colorblind perspective, which sort of kind of is tagged to the idea of the disavowal of race as such, several things get attached to it. First, issues of integration, in terms of integration. The cultural identity of immigrants then is used to explain their lack of integration into the Swedish society, right? The second thing that happens is places any kind of discussion on structural inequalities on the back burner, whether you're looking at economic policies, you're looking at labor market integration, you're looking at disparities in accessing healthcare. All these kind of get subsumed because of a certain kind of logic. And third, as we have discussed already, there's a complete lack of recognition of white privilege. And what in turn happens is that many kind of issues are then sort of projected onto ethnic minorities, who then have to bear the guilt of being, let's say, different, but not at the cost of white bodies relinquishing their privilege. So this is something that we see in our day-to-day, like Rituparna, you were asking about, decolonizing the academy. Now, in that also, the whole issue of white privilege is very central. So we just have to wait and see that hopefully, there will be some kind of positive developments from these global debates. Now, in relation to that, in the second half of the question is, you could then say that whiteness as such, that it then constitutes the core, the central core of Swedishness. A real Swede is a white Swede. And here, then whites also have a privilege of interpretation to define what may be said, how it can be said, and from which position it can be spoken, and which realities are then seen as valid. Again, pushing sort of the ethnic minorities and people of color to the margin and occupying a superior subject position, rendering experiences of others as either subordinate and invisible. Coming to the question of then visibility and invisibility. So in my narrative, I look at how the processes through which I came to be what I call non-Swedish, and how these notions of visibility, invisibility, or marked, unmarked, they have operated in my narrative in very sort of contradictory, ambiguous, and very unstable ways. And that's very important to highlight because, as you will also agree, our realities are not kind of fixed. They sort of shift and conform and resist. Yeah. So this trope of visibility, invisibility, was used to highlight the experience of marginalization on the one hand and privileged identities in a way that the trope of marked, unmarked does not. Now, in feminist sort of cultural studies, kind of leaning towards identity politics, visibility emerged as a very sort of privileged strategy that various groups used to lay claim on demands for social justice. So what you could say, the ideology of the visible, it in a way presumes a linear trajectory between representation and identity. What one sees is who one is. But this relationship between visibility, power, identity, liberation, it can be limited and limiting. And the purpose of this writing was pretty much to deconstruct the binary that has existed for a very long time between the power of visibility and the impotency that is attached to invisibility. Within, you could say, representational visibility politics. Yeah, it has been used on many grounds by cultural activists that, oh, okay, so if you expand the visibility of people, then of let's say racial, ethnic, or even let's say the asexual others, then we might be moving in the right direction. But it is to dismantle this kind of linear progression. Why? Because if you look at marked and unmarked, on the other hand, now to remain unmarked, it has connotations of invisibility. But the caveat here is that it lacks the sense of erasure behind the term invisibility, because it is associated with privilege and often white privilege. So unmarked signifies the anonymity of privilege rather than social and political marginalization. So in other words, you could say that this apparatus between marked and unmarked, how minority identities are constructed as marked, right? While dominant, largely white dominant identities are positioned as the unmarked generic. Okay, so the idea here was to argue that the power, if you're looking at issues of power, then power can be found in remaining unmarked, unspoken, and unseen, thus calling for a slightly more nuanced understanding for the power of visibility. So this is what I was trying to also highlight through my kind of narrative of being a marked, in terms of marked, unmarked, visible, and visible identities in Sweden.
Right. So thank you, Dr. Thapar, because you've sort of explained everything in a continuity. As we began with questions of the body, and then we, end with the answers to marked and unmarked in terms of course, ideas of privilege and colonialism and the need for decolonial knowledge. So thank you once again for doing this with us. I think this was a wonderful conversation on understanding women's bodies, gender, race, as well as the move towards a more decolonial methodology. So I would like to thank you from the team of Doing Sociology for taking time out for the interview.
Okay, thank you so much, Rituparna.